Well, welcome back to the famous recording studios on the second floor of the Dillard College. Today we're going to be talking about what happens inside the firm in a contrast to what happens outside the firm. So we're going to look at the value chain, which I'm going to tell you right up front is a really easy concept that I have found to be incredibly important when you think about strategy for firms. Then we're going to talk about how to do an internal analysis, which gets into the resource-based view of the firm. And how that ties into competitive advantage. And then finally, I'm going to close by asking you to think about this idea of resources that pertains to you and your career. So, like so many things in strategy, the father of the value chain is Michael Porter. Let me tell you what I don't want you to get too worried about, and that is whether activities are primary or whether they're support. For example, you see that research and development is a support activity, but if you think of a lot of firms, it's hard to call, for example, research and development a support activity in Google because it's the engineers rolling out new web products every day that are really kind of the heart of that business. So don't focus on that so much. What I want you to think about more is how the value chain has evolved. When Porter put it together, he did it based on manufacturing firms because they were the biggest firms in the era when he was thinking about these things. That's not so true anymore. You have firms that deal a lot more in intellectual property and service-based firms, and then you have to ask yourself, what does a value chain look like for them? And this is something that we'll talk about in class a little bit more. But really what I want you to think about in the value chain is, what is it in my firm that I really need to do? And that gets us into this next topic of outsourcing the value chain. When I say the word outsourcing, it, for most people, sets off a very negative gut level reaction. Because what we think about is that we call a US company and we go to a call center in a foreign language where we can't hear the person, or I'm sorry, we can't understand what they're saying. Or where there was a manufacturing job in Wichita, Kansas that was outsourced to Mexico or to China, where that person works all day for less than a skilled worker in Kansas makes in an hour. And those are certainly valid observations of outsourcing, but they don't define the total hemisphere. This is considered the era of the lean startup. For example, through the IDWF contest, I met a lady that sells a product in Walmart. Okay, so this is a product that's good enough to be on the shelves in Walmart. And she has this many employees in her company herself. She contracts out everything: production, logistics, printing, the whole 9 yards. She doesn't really do any advertising. She just has it in Walmart, and that's the end of that. And so you can see that this idea of outsourcing isn't quite as negative. Now, here's the basic theory behind outsourcing, and it's that we can better serve our customers by outsourcing something because this will allow us to concentrate on what we're good at. And it lets other people who are good at those other things do what it is that they do best. And there's a lot of validity to this perspective. For example, I dealt with a small company a couple of years ago that repaired the instrument cluster in my pickup truck. And so I found the guy on the internet, no physical presence. His offices, the repair shop, was in Missouri. And so all I had to do was print out the label for UPS once I put in my order. It was already paid for in my purchase price. I send him my instrument cluster. He repairs it. I get an email from UPS telling me that a shipping document has been created. So bing, I know the product is on its way back. And then magically it shows up a couple of days later. So that guy, through a contractual arrangement with UPS, which UPS has these with who knows how many thousands of firms, their logistics problem and to a certain extent their customer interaction is really cut down because UPS takes care of it all. And who did I deal with face to face? I dealt with the UPS, not with the company. I'll give you another example. Toshiba has outsourced its laptop repair function. So you buy a Toshiba laptop, it breaks, so you send it in to get it repaired. And the company that does that repair is, once again, UPS. The reason that that makes sense is, turns out that laptop repair is pretty much a quick bench diagnosis, determine what component has failed, swap the component, and away to the races. The actual repair time is very brief. The majority of the time that the laptop is away from the customer is spent in transit. And so Toshiba decided to contract with UPS, and UPS does the actual repair at its air hub in Louisville, Kentucky. And this makes sense because now literally the part comes in, say it's shipped out on Tuesday, comes in air Tuesday night, gets repaired on Wednesday, goes back out by air Wednesday night, and the customer has it delivered into the day Thursday. And there's as little wasted time in transit as possible. So we want to say bad things about outsourcing, but in reality, companies have for many, many years and are increasingly resorting to outsourcing, which in theory allows them to focus on what it does best. And let's face it, this works pretty well. Apple doesn't make the iPad, doesn't make the iPhone. The now relatively well-known company Foxconn, Han Hai, a Taiwanese contract manufacturer, is who does the actual physical manufacturing. So Apple has outsourced that almost completely. Another company that's used outsourcing quite a bit with some of its leading edge products is Boeing and the 787. And you can see that Boeing's had some issues with that. And this is one of the things you give up when you outsource a lot, and that's control. The 787 was 3 years late to market. And a good part of the reason for that was because they had trouble with their vendors delivering on their promises, and that generated a lot of delays. And then in the initial operating, the airplanes had some issues too, typically with outsourced parts. That's probably a much, not nearly as big a deal as being made of it, but that's something that certainly as it responds, Boeing would have more control over if it was something that Boeing had done versus a subcontractor had done. And that gets into, I think, the real key question about whether this leads to competitive advantage. Is the capability to effectively outsource a skill in which firms vary widely? In other words, do some firms do it very well, and do some firms do it very poorly? I think probably the answer is yes, that it takes quite a bit of skill. There are unique capabilities to be able to outsource effectively, and firms vary. And that generates some of the discussion about competitive advantage and what leads to a competitive advantage. So I just want to put this bug in your mind right now. As we go through the rest of the course, pay attention to what it is the company does, and by extension, what it doesn't do because it's chosen to hire somebody else to make it happen. That leads into the other major view of competitive advantage and strategy. So we have the industrial organizational model, which is the Michael Porter, Porter's Five Forces, external environment perspective. And then you have the resource-based view that says, well, okay, it agrees with the IO view that says what happens outside the firm is important, but it focuses on what is happening inside the firm as well. What is it about its resource base that makes that company special? And does the company do a good job of capitalizing on that resource base? So RBV's answer to the question, why do some firms outperform others, and you can read this on the slide, is they have either a better resource base or they do a better job of combining those resources. And let me give you a couple of examples off of the stock charts that will lend credence to both of these views of competitive strategy. Now I'm going to have to duck down out of the camera view and go down and call some things up on the screen, so bear with me while I do that. So the IO view says that firms are going to basically move in parallel within an industry. Well, this is the stock chart for United Airlines is in blue on this trace, and Delta Airlines is in red. The green is the S&P 500, and the brown is the ExxonMobil stock trace. Notice that ExxonMobil and the S&P 500 have stayed pretty much together over the past 5 years, and so have, especially if you exclude this time frame, so have Delta and Continental, but yet they've performed very differently than the overall S&P 500. So this says industry drives firm profitability, because you can see that, especially for the past 2 years, in terms of stock price, Delta and United have been almost identical. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes down, the other goes down, even when other things are happening with the broader market. So that would tend to support the IO view. Well, now let's look at the RBV view. Some of you have wanted to talk about the car industry, so let's look at the car industry. This is the stock trace. Blue is the Ford Motor Company. Green is Toyota. Okay? And you can see over the past 5 years, Toyota stock is down slightly, whereas Ford stock has more than doubled. So, and you can see that Toyota has stayed pretty closely to the S&P 500, whereas Ford is the one that's deviated. Well, this is the resource-based view that says, well, it's just not all about the industry, that sometimes firms within the same industry can have very different results. All right, sorry for bowing in and jumping back into the photo. So the internal analysis is looking at what's happening inside the firm, and it says, what can we do? So this would be like where an athlete says, these are the physical things I'm capable of performing. For example, I joked when I was as a PhD student at Texas Tech that I could try out for the football team because I hadn't used any of my athletic eligibility when I was an undergraduate. I have no idea whether that was true or not, but it makes an interesting story. I said, there's just one major problem with that. Here I am, a 45-year-old, out of shape, never been fast, never been talented guy. There's no way I'm ever going to be on the Texas Tech football team because I don't have the skill set. I don't have the internal capabilities to make that happen. This is where you get into your discussion of strengths and weaknesses, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. But let me just introduce it by saying that in some cases, firms aren't always real clear on what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses. And I think one of the most interesting questions is, what do I do about my weaknesses? Do I accept them? Do I try to steer my strategy in a way that my weaknesses don't hurt me? Or are weaknesses something that I need to address and I need to fix? Now, some of that's going to be very context dependent. To a certain extent, firms can probably capitalize on their strengths and minimize their weaknesses. But in some cases, as the industry moves and evolves, it may be that what the firm was good at isn't as important anymore, and its weaknesses are becoming increasingly important, and they're going to have to go out and fix those weaknesses. But philosophically, this is kind of an interesting point that I said I wanted to relate this subject or this discussion to you personally, that's something you're going to personally have to deal with. At your age, you've probably started to figure out, what are you good at? Now, what are you going to do with what you're not good at? Are you going to try to get good at it? Or are you just going to try to double down and make sure you stay in those areas where you are good? This is a slide from another textbook that I think does a really good job of pointing out the flow through resources. Firms get resources, they combine them, they develop core competencies, which they then employ in the process of the business that they hope generates a competitive advantage. We're going to talk about more about some of the things on the slide where it talks about the 4 criteria for sustainable advantage. We've already really talked about the value chain analysis. But I want you to look at that little yellow box I drew on there, and I asked the question, what's going on here? And this is the tricky part about the internal analysis of the firm. I'm going to talk in just a slide about the resource-based view of the firm and walk you through the intellectual underpinnings of it. But I'm going to tell you right up front, it's not about raw material being fed into the firm. It's about what the firm does with that raw material in a lot of cases. And that becomes a lot more of an issue of a black box. How is it that some firms seem to take a given set of resources and generate different and superior competencies than do other firms? And I think that's really the key question in a lot of cases, but also one that is really hard to understand. I'm going to pause here and bring this video to an end, and I will see you in just a minute to talk about the resource-based view of the firm and the valuable, rare, inimitable, non-substitutable theory. See you in a minute.